Well, as the 2019 election looms, there's been lots of debate about whether populism is taking hold in Canada, as it has in many other countries. A new report called Don't Blame the People from the Samara Centre for Democracy suggests that, in fact, populism is not on the rise in this country. But it does warn that some political leaders may be trying to build a populist narrative to serve their own interests. Michael Morden is the research director at the Samara Centre for Democracy. He joins me now from Toronto. Michael, good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Always great to see you, Peter.
We're hearing a lot about populism around the world and how it's having an impact in many countries, including our neighbors in the United States. First of all, what do we mean by populism, and how can it be used to undermine democracy?
I think that's a great place to start because populism gets, I would argue, conflated with a whole bunch of different kinds of attitudes, from attitudes towards immigration to economic anxiety. But I think fundamentally populism can co-occur with those things, but it's also distinct. It's a way of looking at society and politics, which sees society divided into elites on the one hand, people with political and economic power, and on the other hand, the real people, the ordinary people, and it's the people who have legitimacy. So why is that a problem for democracy? I mean, I think some element or degree of populism is democratically healthy. Democracy is fundamentally about the people anyways, and we should watch the elites very carefully. But populism can be used to undermine democratic institutions, and we've seen that around the world where populist leaders will use the language of populism to undermine institutions which stand in the way of their own power, to delegitimize political opponents, to go after the media, and in other ways to consolidate their power.
So it tends to find a life, I suppose, when people lose support for those institutions. And earlier this year, you surveyed, your organization surveyed 4,000 Canadians about these issues. What did you find when you asked about how the government weighs their opinions? What are people feeling about their connection to government?
So what we found was that there's a lot of discontent and a feeling of disconnectedness from government and from politicians. So for example, 60% of Canadians think the government doesn't care what people like them think. So on the face of it, that's a really high number. It's obviously way too many. It's a big problem. But when you put it in its historical context, it's a little bit of a different story. So it's 60% now. It was 85% in the mid-90s.
So it's actually going down.
Yeah. It's actually starting to recede, and we found that with a few other indicators, that discontent really kind of peaked about 25 years ago and has started to actually recede.
Let's look at some of those. You also asked about whether Canadians were concerned that MPs, once elected, quickly lost their connection to the voters. What did you find?
Yeah, so about 63% of Canadians agree. Again, that's a problem, right? That shows a political system that isn't working great. But it was 3/4 of Canadians back in the 90s too. So same kind of pattern there.
And what did you find when you asked people about the rights and powers of the majority? I found this interesting.
Yeah, so about 40-ish% of Canadians think that the will of the majority should prevail over the rights of minorities. That's also thought to be a bit of a populist view, but populism is sort of very majoritarian, less inclined to favor individual rights, minority rights, that kind of thing. So that's, we've noticed that a lot of people are surprised by that finding. It is a significant minority. It's not insignificant by any means. But while we don't have direct comparators, we've looked at some other data which suggests that it's definitely not out of line with where Canadians have been for a while, and if anything, we're becoming a bit less majoritarian.
And when you contrast opinions about the role of elected officials versus ordinary Canadians in the decision-making process, what did the survey say?
Again, about 40% of Canadians think that ordinary citizens would do a better job than elected officials. Some people look at that and think that's pretty high. I'm actually not that surprised by that number. It's fairly consistent and even not especially high when you compare it with when that question's been asked in other countries. Nevertheless, clearly there are not insignificant minorities of Canadians that hold some of these populist views.
Your research found that politicians are using the rhetoric of populism, some politicians, to try to drive their own agendas. How are they doing that?
Well, it's these little linguistic and rhetorical cues, right? Talking about the elites, talking about themselves as being somehow apart from the elites, representing the ordinary people. And then that way you can color your opponents as being elites and enemies of the people. And look, those are old moves in politics. We've heard that kind of language forever. But while we couldn't find any evidence that Canadians are becoming increasingly populist, we were able to quantify an increase in the willingness of Canadian politicians to use that language. So for example, members of Parliament have been complaining about quote-unquote elites in Parliament about 300 times more often in the current parliamentary session than they were 2 sessions ago. So this is becoming more prominent in political language and political discourse.
And yet the research you have suggests the audience for it may be shrinking, in fact, not growing.
Yeah, so ironically, there's this disconnect between elites and ordinary people, and the populism might be coming from the top down.
All right, Michael Morden, always good to talk to you. Thanks for this today.
Thanks so much, Peter.